Just going to wait a few seconds to make sure that everybody who was in the waiting room can join us. Sometimes with the software, it takes a few seconds or a minute for people to be able to get into the room. Can see several people who are joining us now. Hello, everyone. Hopefully people will continue to join, but let's get started. Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today for our distinguished lecture series. Before I get started, I just wanted to acknowledge all of the faculty and the students from Gallaudet Ph.D. in Educational Neuroscience program who are with us in attendance today. I also see the faculty from several different departments. Thank you for joining us. And I always forget this. Let me introduce myself. Hello, everyone. I am Dr. Ilaria Portoletti. I am a faculty member in the Penn program. And I am also the director of the Penn program. We have a special presentation as part of our diversity, equity, and inclusion presentation series. This presenter is also part of our GLIDE graduate level diversity and inclusion. This presentation is part of the series of GLIDE, which is our graduate level diversity and inclusion program. If you are a graduate student, make sure that you document attending today for your GLIDE requirement. This is our last presentation in our distinguished lecture series for our fall semester. So thank you for joining that. We will have more presentations in the spring semester. And last but not least, a few housekeeping items. The chat is open. Please feel free to share your thoughts in the chat. But if you have any questions for our presenter, please do not type them in the chat. Please instead use our Q&A feature on the Zoom. We will respond in a formal Q&A after the presentation is over. If you want to sign your question or speak it in English, please let us know and we will advance you to panelist and let you turn on your camera and microphone. If not, feel free to also type your question in English and I will do my best as possible to translate that question into ASL for our audience. All right, so I will now turn it over to our Penn student, Joseph, for a formal introduction of our speaker. All right, hello everyone, I'm Joseph Pelagano. I'm a white man with a beanie, and it's gray, a tan shirt on, a white turtleneck. I want to give a warm welcome to the PhD in Educational Neuroscience Distinguished Lecture Series hosted by Gallaudet University. This lecture series aims to honor world-renowned scientists in the fields of psychology, education, cognitive sciences, and neuroscience. These different fields and all the interdisciplinary fields in between contribute to the new and growing field of neuroscience. They increase our understanding of the human mind and neural mechanisms of learning. This year's distinguished lecture theme is exploring the human mind from diverse perspectives. Today, I am so honored to introduce our distinguished lecturer, Dr. Oliver Rollins. He is a qualitative sociologist, as well as an assistant professor at the University of Washington's Department of American Ethnic Studies. Dr. Rollins received his Ph.D. from the University of California, San Francisco, and his postdoctoral work at the University of Pennsylvania. And his research explores how racial identity, racialized discourse, and systemic practices of social difference influence, engage with, and are affected by, and make use of neuroscientific technologies and knowledge. Dr. Rollins is also a published author of his book, Conviction: The Making and Unmaking of the Violent Brain. This book traces the development as well as the use of neuroimaging research on antisocial behaviors and crime, with special attention to the limits of how the controversial brain model when dealing with aspects of social difference, power, and inequality. Dr. Rollins' lecture, entitled Toward an Anti-Racist Neuroscience, calls our attention to the need to increase DEDI efforts in our field. In the past few years, VL2 has committed to highlighting diversity, equity, and inclusion in our distinguished lecture series. We hope by inviting these speakers, this work provides new perspective and identities to provide roles for all of our students at Gallaudet University. I would now like to ask you to join me in welcoming Dr. Rollins at this time. Dr. Rollins, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Jessica.
I'm sorry, I need to interrupt just a second. I'm off screen. I want to make sure people can see you and the interpreter because we have some
technical difficulties. So I just wanted to make sure everybody can see both our presenter and our interpreter.
And
can people let us know in the chat if they are able to see the interpreter and presenter, if it's working? Okay, so some people are saying the spotlighting is not working. Right, so hopefully you can see all three of us, Dr. Rollins, the interpreter, and myself. If you're using an iPad or your phone, it's different, but people who are using their computer, hopefully you can see all of us now. Okay, great. Looks like the technology is now working. So sorry about that for the intro. And my apologies for interrupting. Dr. Rollins, the floor is yours.
Yes, that's not a problem at all. Let me first go ahead and share my screen and make sure that part is working. I'm unable to share the screen.
okay, let us work on that.
All right. Okay, it's working now. So you should be able to see the slide now. Not, let me know.
Yes, we can see.
Okay, great. So I will go ahead and start. Thank you for the invitation. Thank you for the very warm welcome. The title of my talk today is Towards an Anti-Racist Neuroscience. And just briefly, I just want to say that I'm using the word towards purposely. I will reiterate this again, but I want us to think about the fact that if we're working toward anti-racism or social justice more general, that we're always moving towards anti-racist, meaning that there's really no finish line we get to cross at the end of this journey and say it's over, that it's a continual work. It's kind of an incessant kind of struggle that we have to continue to deal with. And so that's one thing I want us to think about. We can maybe kind of couch that as the bad or unfortunate part of this. I think the good part about this, or the good news, however, is that one, we're all in this together. We can make strides. I believe that we can move towards this vision, right? But particularly move towards this vision in neuroscience. And so part of what I want to talk about this afternoon is kind of like more or less what will this journey toward anti-racism look like, what should we know, and where should we start? So I'm going to start here in the summer of 2020, which, as you can see here, was dubbed by CNN as the year America confronted racism. As the deadly COVID-19 pandemic continued to upend U.S. society, further exacerbating existing health and social inequities, the unrelenting effects of a different kind of social disaster also received fresh scrutiny. The racial unrest that accentuated the summer of 2020, what CNN reported as the year America confronted racism, or the summer of racial reckoning as captured by NPR, now seem underwhelming, premature, and nevermore. Francis Collins, then director of the National Institutes of Health in 2020, penned an apologetic letter on the NIH director's blog noting, "To those individuals in the biomedical research enterprise who have endured disadvantages due to structural racism, I am truly sorry." Similarly, Rita Caldwell, former director of the National Science Foundation, or NSF, was quoted in Nature saying, "We're in one of those cataclysmic times of change," when asked why she believed it was vital to address the entrenched nature of racism in science. Additional editorials in other prestigious journals, such as the New England Journal of Medicine, Lancet, Science, and Cell, which I'll show in the next slide, also directly urged their scientific audiences to address the latent violence of racism. What is most impressive about the publication of these calls is that each plainly noted that scientific and biomedical publics must recognize racism as systemic, structural, or embedded social inequity. These calls also seem to suggest a need for social justice and racial equity both within and through scientific practices, right? A plea that seems ever more urgent given the US Supreme Court recent rulings on race-based admissions, policies in higher education. Thus, to paraphrase Rita Caldwell's message, it is difficult to quantify how important this cataclysmic time of change is for science and society. Sorry. And here I have a slide of kind of what I was talking about with the evidence of this flurry of publications that have come out since 2020, right? And there's also more evidence in some of my more recent research where a research assistant and I have really just been trying to track and trace how science, and big S science, so including neurosciences and all the other sciences, have been thinking about anti-racism or racism since summer of 2020. And one of the more interesting things we've seen, right, is that the name George Floyd alone, right? So one of my students are just tracing how many times the name George Floyd comes up in certain journals, particularly we're looking at Nature and Science. The name George Floyd alone has come up in over 140 different articles in the journal Nature alone since the summer of 2020, actually within 2 years, right? And so for us, that's evidence that we are thinking about racism, we are thinking about social justice in a very different way than we had before. One of the things I want to think about, though, is that we've been here before. Debates in the 1990s around diversity in biomedical research led to the inclusion of more diverse research participants. However, the new science of recruitmentology, as sociologist Stephen Epstein calls it, inadvertently raised concerns about the way scientific research mechanisms preserve and thus revive the very same inequities they sought to remedy. Recent evidence from sociologist Janet Shim and colleagues suggests that recruitment policies meant to help institutionalize diverse research samples for precision medicine also hinder more critical and meaningful outcomes for diversity and inclusion. We also know that the longstanding technical practices of race-based corrections, calculations that try to take race into account to provide a fair and more accurate assessment of health, have continued to help codify racially unequal healthcare practices. I'll talk about this a little bit later with the case of the NFL and concussion payouts. Since the 1990s, we have tried to implement culturally competent health practices to help combat disparities in health. Yet today, we recognize that such trainings are largely a misdirected attempt to address racism in biomedicine. Researchers like psychiatrist Jonathan Metzl call for a brand new paradigm that would adequately deal with the structural nature of inequality in the health sciences. Maybe the most important contemporary example comes from the now infamous End of Race declaration by former US President Bill Clinton. Following the completion of the Human Genome Project that was supposed to help actualize a more equitable distribution of benefits from scientific innovation. Instead, the Human Genome Project opened the door towards a more discursive molecularization of race, according to anthropologist Duane Fulwiley, that repeated and often in haphazard and inadvertent ways many of the mishaps of the biologization of race from the past. It is clear that we must continue to assess new ways to understand and combat inequalities in science, technology, and biomedicine. But how? We urgently need to develop new interventions to anticipate better the devastating ways that race, racism, and other systemic injustices are revitalized through technoscientific practices, despite the deliberate and ongoing efforts to address them. Thus, our task for the rest of this talk is to think more closely about what is old and new about the way scientific racism operates today, and importantly, how we should move forward or towards an anti-racist science. So I want to start with this slide here with the question at the top of why should neuroscience understand race and racism? This came up actually during a talk I gave to an undergraduate neuroscience class earlier this year. The class was actually reading my book, and I came in to do a guest lecture to talk with the class both about the book and kind of these larger questions about inequality in science. And as we were going around talking about the book, one of the students raised a question, a very brave student, I should say, when I asked, what did you think about the book? And the first thing that the student said was, after looking at the syllabus on the first day, they wondered, why would a basic neuroscience class need to know anything about sociology, right? Isn't this beyond the scope of the class? And so this became a question that I really thought about a lot, right? Like, so how do, why should neuroscientists read my book? Why should they care about some of the issues that the social sciences care about? And really, how can I respond to the student who've asked a very astute question, right? And so partly in this talk is what I'm, some of my answers that I'm trying to think through, right? Of like why we must think about and understand what race and racism is, right? And so one of them, one response I gave is that history is never just in the past, right? So we talk a lot about the history of racism or the history of discrimination in science. We talk much less about how it operates and looks today. Right. And so I want to make the point that race and racism are deeply embedded in our country's past, present, and potential futures. That race is social, but what does that really mean for science or neuroscience? This is kind of a question that always comes up in my larger lectures on race, where I teach these huge lectures, these 100, 200 person lectures, where we're talking about race. And I always ask at the beginning of the year, everyone pull out a sheet of paper and write down quickly, what do you think race and racism is? And most of the time, many of the people in the class, these are also sociology classes, will say, well, race is a social construct, right? And that's great. That is the correct answer. So you got the correct answer on the test. But the next question I usually ask is, what does it mean for race to be a social construct? And most people are not really clear. So we know that race is a social construct, but we don't really know what that means, right? And so that leads to what I say are misreadings of race, right? Which can lead us toward kind of a colorblind scientific racism, and I'll talk about that as well. And the last case that I'm thinking about is just imagination as an intervention. And that is that we need to be thinking, and we talked a little bit about this in the conversation with students before the talk, we need to be thinking about new ways to intervene upon discrimination, inequality within the science, right? To really rebuild and rethink the science, right? And so here, I want us to think about two things. One, more than diversity, right? I want us to think about equity, and that representation is not enough. So this is actually kind of going beyond DEI or diversity. So reflection number one is to think about this notion that history is never the past, right? So we're never really outside of that, right? And this is particularly important when we're thinking about questions of systemic inequalities. The very reason we call them systemic or we call them structural, right, is because they have been baked in over time into our everyday normal practices, procedures, institutions, particularly within the United States, right? And so this is especially important for them thinking about, how race is made and remade over time, right? So since the Enlightenment era, right, we have really been told to kind of uphold kind of scientific objectivity, rationality, to be transformative, right? And at the very time, we know there's a lot of evidence that suggests that our very notions of race and the way in which we think about this today also came out of that time, right? And so here you can kind of see in the background, this is a picture of the famous or infamous kind of Samuel Morton skull collection that's at the University of Pennsylvania, right? And there, one of the things that we've learned over time is there's always been a way that there's been inherent racial meaning, right? And dependencies have been part of our scientific progress, right? Our pursuit of scientific progress. So as much as we say we want to be transformative, objective, and rational, we've always had a way in which these inequalities have kind of like worked their way into the things that we do, right? And so that's what I want us to kind of think about. And here I'm going to use a kind of different example, not an example of like what we would think about as the traditional racist scientists, but an example of the way in which we try to move on beyond race and didn't quite achieve that, I guess I should say, right? And so the example that I'm using here are what we call the two statements on race from UNESCO, the United Nations Educational, Scientific, and Cultural Organization General Council, which came out right after World War II, right? And so after World War II, right, there were some conversations among scientists, right, given what had happened in Nazi Germany, to really think about what to do with this question of race, right? And partly what they say is that race hatred and conflict thrive on scientifically false ideas and are nourished by ignorance, right? And that's what they wanted to address, right? They didn't want for the things that had happened before to happen again. And so they asked a group of scientists in 1950 came together. It's actually a group of mostly social scientists and biological scientists came together. And what they wanted to think about was, what do we do with race? And one of the things that this group does is this group came together and they said, well, the big take home was that race is ideological, right? And particularly they divided race into two parts. They said there is a social race, which is a myth, right? And then there is a biological race, which we've never really been able to capture, right? And they said, basically, the way in which we've been thinking about race, both through science and society, is often this quote unquote myth race, this social race, right? And this social race is what's underpinning these ideologies of racism, right? And so more or less, this happened in 1950, more or less everyone agreed, right, that this was kind of the case. Everyone except for a few folks. And so you had another panel that came together in 1951 that was mostly physical anthropologists and geneticists, right? And they pushed back on a very particular point, right? The point that they pushed back on was not that race is a myth. They agreed that race was a myth. The point that they pushed back on was a point that the 1950 panel made around the question of mental traits, of mental traits. And what they essentially said is that race has nothing to do with mental ability and things like that. And the second group essentially said, well, actually, we're not quite sure that there aren't biological ways that are tied to race that may actually tell us something about folks' mental and cognitive abilities, right? Maybe we just haven't had the right technologies to figure that out. Maybe we have just went about this the wrong way. But essentially, they didn't want to close the door on the idea of thinking about differences in mental traits, right? And so what was supposed to be a way in which to close the door on race actually revived this kind of question. And so sociologist Jenny Reardon at the University of California, Santa Cruz tells us that far from making the exit of scientists from the social debate about race, the UNESCO statements argued that society would be better off if scientists with their expert knowledge played a greater role in understanding race, right? And so when we were supposed to have this closed when we were supposed to like move on from race at the middle of the 20th century, we actually opened the door for race, right? And so what Reardon tried to tell us here, where she's essentially also saying that history is kind of never just in the past, what Reardon was trying to tell us is that once we got to the Human Genome Project and these questions of race came back, that it was almost inevitable that these questions of race would come back because we never truly closed the door on the questions of race before. So even when we were trying to fix the past in a way, it kind of still lived with us in these very sticky ways, right? The second reflection comes from some work that I did, and I believe some of you have read one of the articles that we did. And this is to think about race as social, but what does that really mean, right? And this example really comes from an article that we wrote that I'll talk about a little bit later, which was in somewhat response to this editorial from Roberto Covella and Sergio de la Sala in the journal Cortex, right? And this is very interesting, if you've ever read their editorial, it's a very short, like one-page kind of editorial. And to me, it's very interesting because in part, they're using arguments from Dorothy Roberts, the law professor at the University of Pennsylvania, who was also my postdoc mentor, right? And so part of the argument that they're using is saying that just like Roberts argues that we need to take race out of genetics, we need to take race out of neuroscience. But what I argued and as I read this, the first thing I thought about is that this is kind of a misreading of what Roberts' work kind of was saying, because Roberts is not necessarily making an argument that you just delete the word race out, right? And one of the things that they called for was a radical ban on the term race in all sciences, including neurosciences. And what this kind of hung up, what kind of made me think about a lot is that whether or not just erasing out this term actually is progress, right? Is this actually moving us forward in the way in which we want to move? And so really I turned to one of my other mentors, Troy Duster, who is professor emeritus at UC Berkeley and I believe at NYU as well. And part of Troy, so in Duster's work, right, Duster was writing about race and science very early. One of the first people who had actually wrote a lot about the Human Genome Project in his book, Backdoor to Eugenics, which came out in 1990, or 91, I should say. And in that book, Duster really talked about the potential for a new type of eugenics to come out of the Human Genome Project. And at the time, people laughed it off or thought, no way, we're not, we've moved well beyond these questions of race now. It's the 1990s. And then by the 2000s, we noticed that there was a lot of attention back on race in the Human Genome Project, right? And so the way in which the way in which Duster kind of thought about this, though, right, is that instead of removing race, he like what we're saying is like, you can't just remove race, right? And what he said is that purging science of race may not be practical, possible, or even desirable for some research questions. What Duster was wrestling with was this idea that on the one hand, to understand disparities or inequalities in race, you have to actually say race. You have to actually acknowledge that race is doing some work, right? So you can't just not think about it. And at the same time, you're walking what he calls this kind of tightrope, where you're also not trying to endow race with some false biological meaning, right? By studying disparities, let's say in health. And he says that this is kind of the question that scientists are always kind of teetering with, right? Actually, healthcare researchers, all of us, right, are really teetering with this idea of like not making race biological, right, or seeming biological, and also then dealing with the actual violence of race, right, in a way in which it kind of operates, right? And so Guster really wants us to kind of think about that tenacity of race, right? The way in which scientific or way in which social constructionism really works, right? And so for him, like others, part of what he's saying here too, which doesn't come out a lot, but it's very important, is that the very idea of a biological notion of race is a social construction in itself, right? That we've constructed these kind of ways in which phenotype matters, right? And because we've constructed these things in a way, it's very hard to kind of just toss them to the side because that is the way we do race. On the other hand, by simply taking race out, it's not just what we see all the time in the way in which racism and discrimination works. It's also kind of what's normative. And so he's saying those normative things, right, won't just go away by simply removing the term race. Now, what I want to do quickly, right, is to kind of step back, though, and for us to think about, though, well, what is race? I've been tossing around this term for a while. So, like, what exactly, how do we define race? In our work, in the Pearson Cortex, right, we defined race as a socio-political practice, a system of power that has been historically woven into and made culturally visible through the constructed interdependence between supposed obvious phenotypes of difference, like skin color, hair texture, and the political governance of society based on unequal interests and values. Now, you're probably asking, what exactly does that mean, right? Because it's a nice, neat sociological definition, but for most of us, it's really hard to understand exactly what does that mean. Like, what does it mean that this is a socio-political practice, right? You would almost need a whole sociology degree to even understand kind of what we mean by our definition, right? And so when I teach race, what I do instead of having these nice, neat definitions is to force us to think about the characteristics of race as a social process or as a social practice, right? And so there's eight things, right, or really 7 things that I really want us to think about. So one is that race is always already political, right? So we hear a lot of times that folks are trying to make something political by bringing in race, but race is always political. And what we mean by that is not simply, a liberal, conservative, red or blue kind of in the US sense of, politics. What we really mean by that is that there's something at stake and there's a way in which race helps organize and reorganize our both our groups within society and the lived chances that they have, right? Their life chances. So that's what's at stake, right? Who gets certain access to certain things and who doesn't, right? Who is worthy and who is unworthy? Like that's what's the politicalness about this. That it's more than phenotype, right? So that race is not biological, and we can talk about more about what that means, but more or less that it's not phenotype, right? That it's not the hair texture, it's not the eye color, right? None of these things can neatly define one race from the other. That race changes across time and space, right? And this one sometimes is a little hard to kind of understand, like what do we mean that race changes across time and space? So this is one I will use an example to kind of help us understand. So a good example of this comes from the US Census, right? So every 10 years since 1790, the United States has taken a census. And every year since 1790, we have asked a question related to race, right? In the first original census, we've asked who was free and white, who was enslaved, and who was other, right? And slave, in that sense, operated as a proxy for being Black. For the most part. We didn't ask about other categories, but as the census continued to go on, we added new categories, took some categories off, right? So already we're seeing how this is kind of changing. Like first, and if you just follow how we characterize people of African descent, it went from slave all the way up today to African American. So that is changing. But what also has changed is how things got put on and taken off. So a good example of this is the category Mexican. In the 1920s or so, we added a category to the US Census that said Mexican. By 1940, we had taken that category off. So if you think about this, right, if you were born before 1920, right, and you, let's say, actually, had ancestors that who lived across the southern border, so you would call yourself Mexican, but you were born in the US, you would have been born as white at that time, right, because there was no category of Mexican. By the 1920s, your category would have been Mexican. By the 1940s, when we took the category off, you would have went back to being white. Nothing about you physically changed at all, but the category in which we use within the United States to distinguish you from other groups had changed, right? And that's what we mean by it's changing across time. And so therefore it's based or works through social power. It structures our society into hierarchical arrangements. It produces real social, economic, and psychological implications. It's made through our social relationships and experiences, right? So we continue to remake this every time we go out in society, right? We use race as these kind of ways in which to kind of determine worth. And so therefore, instead of just simply a social construct, right? What we like to say is that race is a social process, right? It's always kind of, you're always in the making. It's always being made and remade over and over again. And so the question is, how do we disrupt this making? How do we stop it from like being remade over and over? And so utilize within our society. And so if we come back then, right, to this question then of scientific misunderstanding of race and our piece that we wrote. This is the piece that we wrote in Cortex that was somewhat in response to what De La Sala and others were writing, right? What we wrote, though, in a larger kind of argument is that there was a misunderstanding of what race meant, right? And what we meant by that is that, on the one hand, existing neuroscientific conversations about race, for the most part, had failed to deal with the socio-political nature of race. That race can be used in a scientific writing as an analytic. So we argue that you actually could use race, that we could actually think about race as an analytic, right? As a way to understand that race is doing some work. And what do we mean by that? So instead of just simply erasing race out, one of the arguments that I made was that, well, I use race all the time in my work. I use that term all the time. And it's not me trying to reinforce some biological misunderstanding about race, right? In fact, it's to try to expose how the power of race kind of impacts and influences our society. And so you actually could use the term to kind of expose and confront those things within kind of either scientific technology or our scientific practices or the ways in which our science impacts or is translated into larger society. We also must understand or contemplate on what the social construction of race really means. And it's kind of what I was trying to force us to think about in those last two slides about defining race. And then simply calling race unreal, as happened kind of in the original article from De La Sala and Cabela, can lead us to kind of a colorblind scientific racism. And what we mean by that, this comes from sociologist Eduardo Bonilla Silva, who makes an argument that there's a way in which, particularly in the 1990s, way in which folks were responding to race and racism was to say things like, I don't care about color, or I don't see color, or race doesn't really matter to me, right? And so in that way, race was almost thought about as like outside of us, where we've moved on from that, yet we hadn't really fixed the systemic ways in which racism operates. So just by simply saying race doesn't matter anymore, it's very different from actually addressing the systemic racism that actually impacts us. And so my reflection number 3 kind of deals with this question of thinking about neuroscientific racism today, right? So what does racism mean for us today, right? How should we think about racism today? And this is also coming from the same article that we had before, that I showed before. Our definition that we had, right, for scientific racism is that scientific racism is the intentional or inadvertent dependency upon scientific data, proof, and above all, authority to establish, reconstitute, and justify biological, cultural, and political forms of racial discrimination and the structures of racial inequality. Again, a very technical, very sociological kind of definition. And so I want us to kind of think about then, what does that mean for us? So one is this kind of question of intentionality, right? And so that scientific racism does not need to be intentional, right? And so when we're calling out scientific racism, when we're calling out discriminatory practices, this is not an accusation for the I guess, researchers or the lab or the institution. This is to really think about what the work of, scientific racism does. And it may be that scientific racism or scientific inequality is operating in the means that you don't even see the term race, right? That kind of colorblind fashion. that there's a politics of science, right? And again, this is not the kind of conservative liberal way, right? But that we need to think about the fact that how scientific proof and knowledge can be used in multiple ways beyond the lab. So that in many ways, we don't have control of how some of this knowledge gets used within larger public. And so this begs the question of what's the responsibility of us as scientists to help society understand both what our data means once they leave the lab, what our results means once they leave, and also then how people use or misuse that within larger society. This question around social problems and scientific fixes, right? And so to me, this also comes to, this really speaks to the conversation we were having earlier before, right? And the neat way I try to say this is that the questions we ask circumscribe the types of solutions that will be utilized, how and where, right? And so in the next slide, we'll talk a little bit about that example of, EEGs and certain hair types, right? But that's a really good example of like, there's a particular type of problem we needed to design something to actually then elicit, brain, to be able for us to kind of trace these kind of brain responses, right? But the way in which we circumscribed that problem, the way in which it was very normative, actually then built a particular type of headgear that didn't work on certain hair types, right? As we'll see in the next slide. And so that's a way in which us to think about like how we're actually even framing what is a problem will then also then circumscribe how we decide to fix this problem or build technologies around this. And then the last one that I want us to think about is progress, right? And I could have did a whole talk on like the problematic ways in which we think about progress. But the thing I want us to think about here is how narratives of racial progress, right, in both science and society are intertwined. So the way in which we think about race within society and the way we think about race within science are intertwined, right? And so if we think in society, we're moving beyond race, right? You may not expect to see the kind of explicit racism out of science in the same way that we saw, let's say, in the early 20th century. You'll see, as Bonilla Silva said, a more kind of colorblind notion. Well, the reason why we see colorblind racism or that we see kind of this notion of being race neutral is because us as a society are also at a point where we're thinking about things in a very colorblind fashion or a very race neutral kind of fashion. So I'll just speak a little bit on this because we did discuss this a little bit in our conversation before, but one kind of example of this, and these are kind of examples of ways in which we've tried to move forward, right? But really ran into kind of some problems, and there's still things that we need to problem, comes from this notion of what I call kind of hair type as a proxy for race, right? And so the work from Webb, Eder, and Kwanzaa tells us that tells us that there's been a significant bias in the use of EEGs, right? So they argue that the problem is that the technology as it functions now requires secure, direct, and longstanding electrode to scalp contact, right? But this means that it will exclude, right? Or, exclude certain types of hair, right? And so that researchers have often tried to deal with this, right? By then also saying, well, only certain people could be within the population. And there's a way in which we have to think about what that kind of work does, because it allows for kind of this implicit allowance, I would say, of a continuation of the same type of social policies and practices that try to limit or ban certain like natural hairstyles within society, right? So it's doing a very similar work in the way in which we would say that having a particular type of hairstyle marginalize you in a kind of way. It does that kind of work, but in a very implicit kind of way, right? And so there have been ways in which we've tried to address this problem, right? But there's this larger underlying normative question here, right? And that is how we build models of our science, right? And so the example that I want us to think about here comes from another piece of work that another project that I'm doing that I don't have a slide on it, but I'll kind of talk us through it. And that is folks who do research in the neuroscience of implicit racial bias, right? And for the most part, and I can talk about in Q&A kind of what that science looks like, but for the most part, the most consistent kind of outcome that we have, right? And these are folks who are looking at the relationship between what we may call implicit racial bias and the function of the brain. They argue that folks who identify themselves as white tend to have a bias or an implicit bias toward folks who identify themselves as being Black, right? Now, the model, right, there's a large kind of model in a way in which it's a relationship between the FFA and the amygdala and the prefrontal and areas of the prefrontal cortex, how all of these areas both help us recognize race and then also help us mitigate particular types of biases. But that whole model then is built off of these larger findings from the data that says the majority of folks who identify as white have these implicit bias towards folks who identify as Black. What's very interesting to me is that if we take this model and we say, well, what about the folks who identify as Black? Like, what are their results? So if you take those folks who identify as Black, about a third of them have a bias toward people who identify as white. About a third of them have a bias toward people who identify as Black or themselves, their own in-group, I should say. And about a third of them have no bias. I'm in that third group, by the way. I have no bias, apparently. The third group has no bias, right? But what this makes us think about, or at least what it makes me think about, is like, if that's the model of this group, right, that may actually be the model of a lot of other groups. And that could be the model that we built our science off of. What would it look like if we built a model that says, well, actually about a third of the population has a bias toward themselves, a third of the population has bias toward outgroup, and a third of the population has no bias, right? And what does it mean for us to say that this group who identify as white do have a particular kind of different bias, right? But the model is built off of the really smaller population of people who would, let's say, have a bias toward people who are Black versus, I think, a larger population who wouldn't, right? So this is kind of this work of the kind of the normative way in which we think about science, right? We build it off of these kind of models that we think can extrapolate to everyone else, but they don't always do that work. And we continue to do that. The second piece that I want to think about is this kind of question of race norming or race correction, right? And as I said before, race norming and race correction are these ideas that really come out of the early part of the 20th century, where we essentially said that in order to have adequate health, adequate health, or deliver adequate health, I should say, that we really need to think about that there's differences, right, in between racial groups. And it may be differences between these racial groups in the types of measures that we have around health, right? There's a very famous or infamous case around the spirometer, right? This technology that was used to help us think about lung capacity, in which African Americans were said to have a smaller lung capacity. And therefore, when you're using the spirometer, having a lower measure for certain populations would still be in the norm, right? Here in this example, we have from the National Football League, where, as you see in the headline, it says the NFL reversed on race normings, revealed pervasive medical racism, right? What happened here is that the NFL, as many of you know, is going through, kind of a wave of, players who are having concussions, and therefore the NFL is, in some ways you can get paid out, or the NFL can help you with some of your medical bills down the line. But the first thing you have to do is you have to go through the NFL concussion protocol in order to see if you do have these kind of long-standing cognitive inabilities, right? And what we found, or what folks have found, is that the NFL was using kind of two different standards. For their Black players, right, they were using a race norming standard that says, well, Black players or Black men have lower cognitive ability than most others. And because they have a lower cognitive ability, they also needed to score lower on these cognitive tests to then meet the requirement for payout. So you essentially had a league that is, I think, 70% Black right now, that was actually kind of built in a particular type of discrimination in which it says that in order for certain groups to get paid out, they needed to actually have a much lower cognitive ability, right? And if you think about it, one of the things that we're doing is we're simply using race, right, in this kind of biological sense, right, without ever testing for cognitive ability. So we're not testing to see which individuals' cognitive ability look like. We're taking that as a proxy to say, because you're Black, therefore you should have a lower cognitive ability. And if you don't have, if you don't in some kind of way measure up to that in the testing, then you don't get paid out. So then this brings us to kind of the concluding kind of slides, and that is how to think kind of towards an anti-racist neuroscience. And so I had a piece that I wrote in, I'm sorry, the slide's a little messed up, in Nature Human Behavior. And essentially what I argued is that we need to move toward kind of an anti-racist neuroscience, and that the path toward anti-racism must revolutionize the very ethical bonds between accountability between neuroscience and society. And so largely more than the neuroethics, I was calling for a new politic, right? A purposeful, unyielding commitment to social justice. And so the question then is kind of how do we get there? And so partly I want us to kind of then think with UCLA historian Robert D.G. Kelley, right, and his work around kind of imagination. And so in his 2003 book, Freedom Dreams, Kelley tells us that we must tap into the well of our own collective imaginations, that we do what earlier generations have done, dream. Without new visions, we don't know what to build, only what to knock down. We not only end up confused, rudderless, and cynical, but we forget that making a revolution is not a series of clever maneuvers and tactics, but a process that can and must transform us, right? And so the way I think about this is I'm trying to think about ways in which we can reteach, rethink, and reformulate our understandings around race. And so one is to reteach. And so the picture here you see is Princeton professor, Dr. Ruha Benjamin. And part of what Benjamin gives us is one is kind of think about this notion between race and technology, right? And so here, when I say reteach, I want us to reteach or teach about racism as a productive and destructive power, right? And so Benjamin tells us that racial technologies are in the business of manufacturing natures, right? That they are amnesic and dulling, a kind of racial minimalism that allows for more and more racist violence to be less and less discernible, right? And so for us, we can ask ourselves, what happens when racism comes imperceptible to the everyday medicine science, to the everyday use of technology's knowledge in everyday life? So what does it look like for racism to become less discernible? And then what does that mean in our work, right? So to think about when she's saying it's becoming discernible, she's also saying in a way, it's becoming very productive, right? That it's being used within our society in ways that we don't even realize many points of the time, right? And so how do we call out, how do we see that? How do we make sense of that? Ways in which racism is operating in that way? And that's to really rethink how we teach about racism and understand racism. Secondly, I want to go to Wesleyan professor Anthony Hatch's work and to rethink right here. And this is to really rethink the disparities framework, or what he calls a racial spectacle. And so in his work over the 2020, looking back at the kind of summer of 2020, what he calls the Health Disparities Archive, and he kind of calls out the function of health disparities research in a way. And what he says is that racial health disparities function as a racial spectacle that generates scientific and moral fatigue and fosters the conditions for structural gaslighting. He says, as a spectacle, such data can help institutionalize and shore up malignant forms of medical neglect and structural gaslighting directed towards racial and ethnic minority populations living in the US. What Hatch was really getting at, right? He raises this question because I remember seeing him give this talk, and he raised this question about how much work do we need in racial disparities? How much more data do we need in racial disparities in order for us to act, right? He essentially said that we're at a point that we have enough data to know that racial disparities exist, racial inequalities exist. At what point do we act, right? And so for him, he says we need to rethink this kind of notion of disparities. The other part here, and this is a challenge that I think we have to do, particularly when we're thinking about healthcare, right, is to rethink the language of disparities in the first place, right? We tend to use this in the biomedical sciences a lot to talk about disparities when we're talking about certain discriminated or marginalized groups. And I think we have to think about new ways to talk about these groups beyond just disparities, right? So me as an African-American man, my health should be understood more than just in the language of disparity, right? So we need to also rethink that then, like what are we doing when we constantly are thinking about marginalized groups as disparity, right? As some kind of burden upon the healthcare or criminal justice system or larger society versus an active player, citizen, and things like that, an actual human being. The last piece I'll say, it comes from some work I did with Penn professor Dorothy Roberts when I was her postdoc. And we wrote a piece thinking about the relationship between, biosocial science, that science that has kind of pushed us to think much more around what is the role of like social variables and measures in relation to biological sciences. And here we want to think, or at least use this as a way to say we need to reformulate or challenge our normative assumptions about knowledge and knowledge production, right? And so we wrote that our analysis does not conclude that biological determinism is inevitable anytime biological sciences or biotechnologies approach social problems. The problem is not the technological usage per se, but its ability to obscure ethical uncertainties and structural forces and to reconstitute problematic sociocultural assumptions that researchers rely upon uncritically to execute their research, right? So we can go back to the example of the EEG cap, right? This is something we all kind of use. We can think about examples within neuroscience for like these facial recognition kind of tasks, right? These tasks that we use that are usually racialized and gendered faces that we use as neuroscientific tasks in almost any kind of social and cultural effective kind of neuroscience. And what does that do to kind of build in certain types of racial suggestions or kind of racial understandings into our work, right? And also treating it as like a necessary thing that we need in order to do our work, right? And so this is a way in which we need to think about how we build in normative assumptions around ability, disability, race, racism, sexuality, all of these things into our work, many times unknowingly, right? And so really to think about how then once these technologies are kind of being used, right, there's really good examples here of thinking around like algorithms, if you go back to Ruha Benjamin's work, where these things are essentially working on their own in many ways, right, but also reinforcing many of the inequalities that we have in society. And so in the last slide, I'll just say that our next steps for anti-racism and social justice then would be for us to teach and study how and why identity works as a social construct in society. That's part of what I want to talk about kind of early. Identify how racism works through our everyday and relied upon health practices and why this can reinforce existing power dynamics in society without the need for explicit discrimination. Acknowledge that neither medicine nor science is apolitical and that the phenomenon explored are often always already questions about racialized, gendered, class dynamics within society. Thus, neutrality is not an option. Challenge our current DEI responses and our healthcare or health disparities frameworks. And to really think about the fact that social justice requires, as I said before, requires that we all work toward anti-racism. And so this requires a struggle and determination as much as skill, intellect, and care. And thank you for your attention today. I'll start there.
All right, thank you again so much for your presentation, Dr. Rollins. So much wonderful content and learning. Oh, hold on one second. Okay, we can see both you and the interpreter again. As students, we read our article, but I still feel like with your presentation, there's still so much to learn, unpack, still have so many questions. And still feel like there's no easy solution.
That's right.
Right? There's no actionable solution to apply to our research that will ensure that our research is anti-racist. And the one parallel with one thing that you mentioned is that here we do research among the deaf adults and child populations. And we have to think about how our research results often can be mistranslated and how that can lead to adverse effects for deaf children, deaf adults in the future, and how we need to unpack our own processes and procedures to make sure that when we write for public consumption, we need to think about how other people will use our research results and try to make sure that we have our own internal review process, that we have people who are deaf themselves read and give us feedback to make sure that we are advised on making sure that we revise even the language that we use within our articles. And how to think about how we can establish a process or a method to ensure that we are going toward an anti-racist science, thinking about what processes could be in place in the IRB process. Can we set up that kind of perspective, that type of panel that would be able to provide feedback, or to provide a heads up about the research before the research even starts, so that we don't even get to the place where that kind of research is published. Do you have any vision for what that could look like?
Yeah, that's so I want to first acknowledge that I think, as you were describing some of the things that you're already doing, I think we also need to acknowledge the fact that some of us are already kind of doing this work. Like, it sounds like you're already doing some work that's really already pushing toward a more social, just kind of understanding of science. And that in many ways, there could be lessons that other universities could learn just about even some of the ways in which you're very careful about how your results are put out. Like, all of these little things are things not all labs or not all universities think about. And so I want to first acknowledge that I think these are already some important steps that you're making, and that, even the way you're saying them is almost like, we do this, but it's like they're built in though. That means that you already have built them into the everyday normal way in which you do science. And there's not just some extra thing that's being thrown on. That's just how you produce science, right? And I think that's very important for us to kind of understand and acknowledge when you're making a very normative stance around this is how science should be, right? It should already have this, right? And so I just want to acknowledge that. And then also, yeah, I think, even that kind of question around the IRB, right? It always raises a question around, well, who is on our IRBs, right? Because we can pose these questions to IRB, but they don't always catch them either. And that has partly to do with kind of the training. And I think it's a training for us, which for me, I think we have to begin to think about not simply how we train us as professors who may sit on IRBs, but also how we're training our students both at the undergraduate and graduate level to already be thinking about these things in the making of their science, right? And so one of the projects that I'm working on now is to really focus on groups from marginalized positions who are in the graduate student, postdoc, early professor range, and having them kind of really be in conversation around what are certain things that you want your science to do in the future, right? What do you think are potential hurdles for that? And what can we do to kind of then move forward? So it's really trying to use that imagination of them at a very much younger age of what they're trying to think about and do with their work. Because there is also a reality that many of us, once you're in, there's so many other constraints that we are also trying to think about of how to kind of do this work, right? And so one of the things I would say is yes, I do like the IRB idea. I think there's a question around training. I think there's a way in which you can highlight what's already being done, not as a way to say I'm bragging on what we're already doing, but to just really say that, look, these are things that are embedded, these are core values into what we do already, right? And that is important because that is a very normative way of saying the science can be done better in its way because we're already kind of addressing these things. And I guess the last thing is that the hard part, and you said it, the hard part is that there is no simple solution to these things, right? And I mean, the thing I want us to kind of constantly do is constantly, struggle and fight against ways and find ways, I should say, of how to address these types of things, right? But that there won't be a simple solution, right? Because even with what you implemented, we don't know what will happen 5 years down the road where maybe funding change, something will change where we actually have to then change too, to then be able to address how those inequalities get built in. I know they didn't totally answer your question, but yeah.
No, that's fine. I'm just thinking about, what you brought up about funding and funding mechanisms and how things can change. And for the example, now the NSF has a strong focus on diversity, equity, and inclusion, and have started to fund projects and give, monies to research that is more inclusive and more actively inclusive of students, faculty from diverse backgrounds. But what you've said is true. What if 10 years from now, their focus shifts? What's going to happen when that's no longer the focus? How can we continue to make this normative? And how can we achieve this being part of, built into science, how we can transform scientific practices so that's not just lost when the focus shifts? So for example, now I'm thinking about how NSF has a lot of grants and money that goes for diversity. And so, I think that people have started to, I think maybe we could, write a grant that establishes a panel that's separate from any university who can oversee all research or publication that comes out of NSF. But again, if it's then funded by NSF, then you're always going to have this panel have a short life that only lives up to the time of the funding.
Absolutely.
Or I wonder if we can, think about making sure that we are, calling those from African ancestry or African Americans to be part of the panel. But again, just thinking about how we set that up. But then the same people will then be burdened with that work, meaning that they will have less time and space for their own research. I don't know. There's just a lot of things that, I'm thinking after your presentation, and just acknowledging that there's maybe difference between long and short-term solutions. Christina, I see that you've raised your hand.
Can I respond real quick to that though?
Sure.
So I think, everything you said is absolutely right. And it's the same things I feel like I struggle with too. One of the things that you said though, that I think we have to think about. So in that project I was saying where I'm looking at these, this is a project where I'm really trying to frame this question toward an anti-racist or social justice kind of neuroscience. And one of the things I'm as a qualitative researcher, I'm really thinking about the relationship between what one of my mentors call these kind of different social worlds around neuroscience. So not simply, I think it's a comment that says interpreter is missing. Just want to make sure this. Okay, maybe, okay. So, there it is. So I think the important part about what you were saying was that it's not simply, a funding mechanism that says, let's, do more DEI, right, to solve these problems. I think we have to think about other types of practices that don't look racialized or gendered or any of these things, but also do that work. So here's the example that I used when I was thinking about this work was, one of the things we say all the time as social scientists is that researchers who use race, and this particularly came out of the stuff in the Human Genome Project, need to define what these racial groups are in their research. So don't just say you have, African Americans or Arab Americans or whoever in your study, that you actually tell us what you mean when you say that, right? And I can understand, I totally understand that as a sociologist why it's important, but then also the very way in which we publish in the sciences is very different from the social science. Social science articles can be 30 plus pages, right? I have plenty of space to write out what these things are and long definitions like I did there. In many of the science publications, though, that's not the case, right? And so for me, that's a structural kind of problem on the publication side that then hinders the researcher from even doing some of the things that they want to do, right? And so there's a way in which we also have to think about what's happening in these other spaces, right? From funding to publication, just the administration that we have in the university system that are sometimes hindering some of our progress that we do. And it's not necessarily because of something that's explicitly racial or sexual or something like that. It could be something like a procedure like that, right? We can also think about the procedures of like even what we think about as productivity within the academy. So only going after grants and only going after publications, then obviously, yes, those folks who need to actually sit on these DEI boards and do all that work are going to feel like they're more burdened, right? So why aren't we celebrating other ways of productivity within the academy? And that's a very different kind of move than simply saying, let's do more DEI.
Good point. And then I think Christina had a question. I just wanted to make sure that Christina, it can be spotlit for the audience. Hi, I'm Christina Kim. And again, thank you so much for your remarks. Try to recognize, advocacy and action for more equality can also be more burdensome on certain groups. So I'm wondering, what do you feel would be the best way of support from allies? What kind of activity, not only on your campus, but what have you seen in other academics or academic institutions that allies can do? And also personally, how do you take care of yourself when you're doing all of this advocacy work and the academic rigor that's required, and also not feel overwhelmed? Thank you.
Thank you, Christina. So the last part, I can say that I don't do a good job of that part, taking care of myself. I probably need to do more of that, and I'm glad you called out that because rest is very important, and we all need that. The other part, I think there's various ways, right? And sometimes it's very specific to the institution that you're at, of like what is needed, I think, from allies, right? Even what, I mean, the first thing I thought about too is like who counts as an ally, right? Because that's another very interesting question, like who counts as allies? And what I mean by that is that, if we think in a very intersectional way, there's ways in which, like, on the one hand, folks can say they can be an ally to, let's say, the African-American population here, but then there's other ways as me being a male needs to be an ally to women on campus and the things, or trans folks on campus and the things that's happening to them, right? And so a way in which we all are kind of doing that dual work, and many of us who are in these marginalized positions, that you also need to be an ally to certain groups too, right? And then we think more intersectional about that. But I think the things that I've seen that work, so here I'll say one of the things that's happening here in our DEI conversations. I'm part of the DEI group in neuroscience here, so with the graduate students in neuroscience here, and so I get to really hear and think about like how these and it's led by graduate neuroscience students. So that's one thing that I really like of how the structure is. It's really led by the graduate students, right? And so that we are there as just mentors and support, but really to support their ideas, right? And to really, and also really to help them actualize some of these ideas. And so the two big things that they've been thinking about right now with support is recruitment, right? And retention. And these have been just a very small but big things that they want to focus on, right? So how do we recruit more diverse people into the neurosciences, and how do we keep them here on UW's campuses? And what I really liked about it is that they're leading the efforts, right? And so they're doing a lot of the work, and sometimes it's us telling them that's way too much work, and so let us help you do some of this work. And so that's kind of the allyship that we can have as professors to these students. But I think I just really like the idea that it comes from organically from the students sometimes, right? And it's not this top-down administrative kind of way of saying, this is how we're going to do DEI, or this is how we're going to do social justice on campus, that we're really allowing the students to explore kind of what these things can mean, and what they want it to look like, what they want the neuroscience program to look like. Like, I mean, what do you think a neuroscience program should look like that's more inclusive, that's more diverse, that's all of these things that we want to achieve? So that's one way I think of thinking about it. I think there are ways at the top down level, right, being part of these kind of conversations. So like, as much as, you know, it's a lot more work for me, I actually enjoy being both in like panels like this, but also talking to administrators as well, because I have access to them. And so I feel like it's a responsibility, if I have access to, you know, a dean, a provost, or anyone like that, to also then mention, like, here are the things that my students are asking about, here are the things that my colleagues are asking about, because not all of us have access to those spaces, right, in that way. And then I think there's a way in which, and this is a hard way, and I think neuroscience is slowly moving to this in ways of like thinking about beyond the academic space, what is our relationship with larger community, right? And so you'll see that like NSF, NIH have these like calls now, like saying, how do you do like community-based neuroscience research? I have no idea what that's supposed to look like, but I see the calls out there now saying like, we need to be talking more to the community. And I think they're right? I think there's a way in which it's like, how do we engage with community? Because partly if we're saying we need more diverse groups, we need to be engaging with communities and talking about what the neurosciences are, why it's important to think about brain health and things like that, why it's important to like just think about a more diverse group of scientists, right? And really working with our local communities in that way, but also really then be able to think about what are some of the issues that bother them that we can then think about through kind of neuroscience in that way, and a much more kind of collaborative way of saying how the brain sciences are actually kind of to be in the community in ways that like public health does and others in that way. And so I think all of those are kind of ways I've been thinking about, or I've been seeing recently, shaping different kind of responses around, you know, how to be an ally, how to move toward kind of anti-racism or social justice.
Thank you so much. Does anybody else have a question for our presenter? Just checking the chat feature and the Q&A. And just as an FYI for our audience, there is a correction within the chat to the interpretation. So if you would make sure that you read that. Okay, can everybody see the interpreter, myself, and Dr. Rollins again? Sorry for all the technical issues. We're learning as we go. We've been learning since COVID, right?
Same.
We had to transition to Zoom, but still always technical issues arise. I wanted to just let just acknowledge that we're up to 43 people who have joined, which shows that how many people really want to learn about and are interested in learning from your work, and to think about how they all can include, you know, best practices in the pursuit of equality, equity, inclusion, and diversity. And I know I saw the number 46 was at the pinnacle of the discussion. I think that now people have started to sign off because they need to go to their classes or other meetings, but it's a great topic. Like you said, difficult work, and it involves, you know, a lot, not just, you know, thinking about, you know, the standards of work not only being grant writing or publication, but, you know, to acknowledge that there are also other ways of producing work in the academic sphere. So thank you so much for your presentation, and we'll continue thinking about how we can become more inclusive within the work that we do, not only about deaf and sign language using communities, but also about inclusion more broadly. I think we will close for now. If there are no other questions. All right, thank you again, Dr. Rollins, so much. We so
Yes.
appreciated your presentation today, and feel free to keep in touch.
Yes, thank you as well.
And hopefully we'll be able to invite you in person at some point.
Nice. Yeah. I was going to say also, if there are questions, if students have questions or others have questions, I'm happy to answer follow-up on emails. You can send my email out to the list. I'm happy to help. Yeah.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
All right. I will stay, but if anybody has any last questions for me, or Dr. Rollins, if you have any questions for me, but other than that, the panel is, or the presentation is closing for this afternoon. Thank you.
Thank you. Yep. See you guys. Bye.